Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes. All right, great, excellent. Before I get going, I need to take an opportunity to thank the people who made it possible for me to be here with you today, most notably Dr. Gillespie, but also Rhonda Patrick and Antoinette Burrell, who facilitated every aspect of my visit, which has just been lovely. And I'm very appreciative to have this opportunity to be a part of this series. And I'm more than a bit envious of this opportunity that you have on a weekly basis to come and experience and consider various takes on race and difference. That's, to me, quite a luxury, and this seems like a very productive and collective space for that. So it's an honor to be here. And I should also thank you for being here, and I'm going to do my best to honor your choice to spend your lunch hour with me. So as you can see, the title of my talk is called The Civil Rights Work of Black Capitalists. And as Dr. Gillespie said, it's based on material from my first book, Represented, The Black Image Makers Who Reimagined African American History, which was just, and finally, released in July, this past July. So my plan for today is to first spend some time laying out the broad contours of my research and the questions that brought me to the project, and then to zero in on a particular part of the history that the book tells. And so, for the better part of a decade now, I've been consumed with the question of how media representations of Black people and Black life figured into African Americans' strategic efforts to advance their social position and secure their rights during and after World War II. And I'm hardly alone in this focus of visual media and the politics of race. Many scholars have and will study this relationship. And there is more than enough to go around, precisely because, as Bell Hooks has said, the history of Black liberation movements in the United States can be characterized as a struggle over images, as much as it has also been a struggle for rights or equal access. And this is the premise that undergirds my research. I assume that most, if not all of us, have no problem accepting that media depictions can breed stereotypes, and that those stereotypes then can have real effects on people's lived experiences. And the example that I often use with my students is Law and Order. Now, just out of curiosity, how many of you in your head just heard dun dun? Now, I'm a fan. Once upon a time, Criminal Intent with Vincent D'Onofrio was appointment TV for me. But if you have been watching since the early 1990s, as I have, you can't help but notice that across the entire Law and Order franchise, the primary role of Black and brown men is to inject a menacing dynamic into any given scene. The show's producers have consistently and heavily relied on men of color as a plot device or a visual shorthand to communicate to viewers that the main characters or the protagonists have entered a scenario or an environment that is dodgy, criminal, or dangerous. Now, these mainstream representations, I believe, reflect but also ensure a society in which the minority class of Black and brown men constitutes the vast majority of the nation's incarcerated population. Now, of course, this problem is bigger than Law and Order or even television, right? Countless stereotypical images of Blackness circulate through present-day U.S. culture, U.S. visual culture. Thankfully, they now also compete with an abundance of alternative and complex images of Blackness that are also moving through today's media and pop culture. But as you may imagine, this was not the case in the pre-World War II era. In the pre-war United States, the popular representation of Blackness was primarily a white project, in that African Americans had little access to or control over the technologies or channels of mainstream media, right? So what did that look like? Let me give you an example. So this 1937 Life magazine cover captures, I think, how the circumstances that I've just described to you translated in terms of Black Americans' depiction in the media. Now, although a relatively new publication at the time, Life magazine was wildly popular, with a paid circulation over 1 million and then a pass-along circulation over 4 million, meaning that one would have been hard-pressed to find a more influential visual media space than the magazine's cover. And this is the magazine's first cover to feature an African-American man. And as you may imagine, African Americans did not celebrate this as a representational breakthrough, right? Because as a popular image of Blackness, this picture of a faceless, frontless, shirtless, literally backward rural Black laborer, which none too suddenly tapped prevailing stereotypes linking Blacks to watermelons, reinforced notions of African Americans' second-class status. And it was hardly alone. Going into World War II, images that asserted African Americans' inferiority proliferated in US popular culture, alternatingly depicting them as primitive, lazy, shifty, servile, simple, and above all, comical. Now, historically problematic, these images became even more injurious during the 1930s because the United States was giving birth to a full-blown visual culture, in which the rise of photojournalism and other visual medias and image-based marketing were making it such that images were replacing words as a primary means for conveying information and shaping thought. Nowadays, we take our image-saturated culture for granted. In the 1930s, however, it was a thing becoming, and the shift made racist images of Black people more impactful. But with the rise of the images, while it presented African Americans new challenges, it also presented them with new resources for defining themselves in their own image. And in my work, I put Black capitalist image makers at the center of that project of racial redefining. And I should explain here that by image maker, I mean a person or an institute that produced or facilitated the production of media images. And in my book, I focus largely on these two image makers. Publishing magnate John H. Johnson, best known as publisher of Ebony and Jet magazines, and public relations guru Moss Kendricks, Coca-Cola's first Black public relations representative. And in the World War II and early Cold War years, Johnson and Kendricks belonged to a handful of Black businessmen who capitalized quite literally on new technologies, cultural trends, national politics, and consumer demands to popularize media images of Black America that represented African Americans against stereotype and in keeping with prevailing definitions of Americanness. And make no mistake, they did this because it was profitable. In fact, when asked in his later years about the historical significance of Ebony in particular, John Johnson clarified that he wasn't trying to make history, he was trying to make money. Now, you should know that I never imagined that unabashed capitalists were going to be at the center of my work, ever. In fact, I began this project, believe it or not, intent on writing a history about Black women's activism in the larger post-war Black freedom movement. So what could possibly explain this shift? It was a very circuitous route, one that you can trace back to my experiences teaching in graduate school. And in the classroom, I was consistently struck and frustrated by many of my students' seeming inability, regardless of their race, to conceive of complex Black historical actors. And over time, I began to understand that this was in part because in the popular narrative of Black history, or even US history, celebratory narratives of a chosen few heroic figures have come to stand in for complex histories of Black people and Black life. And this is never more evident than right now in February during Black History Month, right? Allow me to demonstrate. Yesterday, I did a Google image search of the term Black History Month. And what returned, of no surprise to me, was collage after collage of primarily the same people. Right? So these African Americans are absolutely historically significant, and they deserve to be recognized, and they certainly should be studied, preferably in all of the months. However, in their iconic or symbolic forms, these figures, I believe, leave my students, and I would argue the multitudes, with representations of blackness that have been so flattened out as to have all the personhood of a paper doll. And if you've ever played with paper dolls, you know that they come with a limited number of outfits or roles. Now, as a civil rights historian, I have the knowledge that often simplistic representations of blackness and black history are a result of image politics that African Americans have used in their struggle to combat racism. And I think a prime example is Rosa Parks. Why, when we now know that Parks was a radical activist who doggedly and openly fought for African American civil rights and fought against sexual violence towards black women and frequently decried and defied segregationist policies long before she refused to give up her seat on a bus in 1955, why did Parks fashion and help promote an image of herself as a mild-mannered and accidental activist? Right? These are the questions that kind of plagued me. I wanted to know what representational strategies that activists like Parks use to break down barriers and gain political and public support. What informed those strategies? And those are the questions that I went looking for in trying to find cultural ideas, trends, and resources that likely influenced African Americans' image politics in the post-war or early civil rights period. And time again, my search led me to media representations of blackness, both visual and conceptual, produced by black media and marketing enterprises, which then required that I look into those businesses, as much as I tried to resist that, looking into those businesses and seriously considering the significance or their significance to post-war black politics and progress. And that, my friends, is how I went from examining black women's civil rights activism to concentrating on the capitalist media and marketing enterprises of black men. Now, in making the shift, I had not anticipated that more than a few people, academics and non, would consider my new focus to be problematic and even offensive. And it quickly became clear to me that we don't like capitalists, generally speaking, in our civil rights stories, unless they are funding activism. And after negotiating this dynamic for several years, I think I understand why, or some of the reasons why. First, the popular civil rights narrative centers almost exclusively on activists and their grassroots activism. Don't believe me? Again, let's turn to Google. I also did an image search of the term civil rights, and what returned was image after image of activist figures engaged in nonviolent direct protest actions. And don't get me wrong, activist and protest actions should be central to the civil rights story. But I believe that this picture, or these pictures of civil rights history, are overdetermined and have fixed notions of that history, of civil rights history, such that capitalists have little to no place in the story. I am convinced also that the general exclusion of black capitalists from the broader civil rights story reflects a general discomfort with the idea of marginalized people participating in and even promoting power structures that facilitate their oppression. Because then we must wrestle with an uncomfortable question. Does the experience of freedom or equality in the United States require going through or shoring up institutions of oppression? But to exclude capitalists from the civil rights story isolates African Americans in their struggle and isolates the struggle from hugely significant forces that shaped the post-war United States, not the least of which was shifting market dynamics. So indeed, I think, or have found, focusing on Black capitalist image makers who were operating in that moment reveals connections between a burgeoning civil rights movement and the rise in political significance of mass consumption and developments in post-war marketing, especially advertising. Moreover, it is my contention that, while not activists, these historical Black actors performed essential civil rights work. And this is a term that I use in not opposition, but versus civil rights activism, to refer to non-activist activities through which African Americans pursued first-class citizenship, including activities that were not oppositional or explicitly political or progressive. And with the remainder of my time, I'm going to outline Johnson and Kendricks' civil rights work by demonstrating how, through their respective image-making businesses, they elevated African Americans, specifically by redefining them as consumer citizens, which in the mid-20th century benefited their quests, African Americans' quests, to combat racism, experience national belonging, and secure their rights as first-class citizens. So I'm going to start with Johnson. And as some of you no doubt know, in 1942, John Johnson, who was a Southern migrant to Chicago and then in his early 20s, founded Negro Digest, which at the time was described as a subscription-based compendium of news items and articles about Black people and Black issues. Now, targeted to Black consumers, Negro Digest was immediately a hit among African Americans, and that emboldened Johnson to expand his publishing enterprise. And in 1945, immediately after the war's end, he launched Ebony magazine, which was a large format Black lifestyle photo magazine, which Johnson conceived of and offered as the Black counterpoint to Life magazine. You can see a little mimicking there, which was a common Johnson practice. So in the press, Johnson described his photo magazine as an antidote to the white media's representation of Blacks as second-class citizens or freaks. It was a product he believed for which there was a waiting market, and he was right. To use his words, Ebony shot out of the gate like a thoroughbred stallion, and its success transformed what was a small shoestring operation on the South Side into a media empire with its swanky worldwide headquarters located in Chicago's South Loop. So it turned out that in the post-war moment, the very racism that allowed so many negative media images of Black Americans ensured that Black authored positive representations of Black America were good business. The Black public consumed Ebony voraciously, sending its monthly circulation skyrocketing from 50,000 to 275,000 within just 3 months of the magazine's life. So while not on the scale of Life magazine, Ebony's circulation numbers made Black consumers, and more importantly, their buying power, visible to advertisers, which was hugely important to the project of visually and culturally redefining Blackness. And I'm going to detail that a little. So prior to Johnson, no Black publisher had created a Black magazine that was successful with major national advertisers. And this was a problem, because contrary to what many people think, magazine publishers do not profit from selling magazines. No, they live and die by selling ad space in their magazines. And it was a failure to sell enough ad space that accounts for why all commercial Black periodicals before Ebony failed. By contrast, Ebony's unprecedented circulation numbers exposed Black markets the size of which white advertisers could no longer afford to ignore, whatever their racial politics might have been. And within 3 years of Ebony's launch, Johnson had secured lucrative advertising contracts with major white corporations, including Pepsi, Beechnut, Colgate, Zenith Radio, and Capitol and MGM Records. And then on the basis of that advertising revenue, the Johnson Publishing Company was able to produce multiple magazines, including Jet, Tan, Hue, and Copper Romance. Meaning, by the early 1950s, the company had become the most powerful Black-owned means of communication in the world, and for that matter, in history. And as such, it had real power to shift the representation of African Americans in media. Whoops. Right. It's 10 years, I'm sorry. But I think that the political importance of Johnson's image-making enterprise becomes even clearer when you link it to Moss Kendricks's. So first, who is Moss Kendricks? Well, Moss Hyles Kendricks is in fact a native son of Atlanta. And the last time that I spent any significant time here, I came to get a sense of how Kendricks lived and moved through the city on his way to becoming a successful, prominent Black marketer. So during a one-week period several years ago, I walked the streets of an area that was once known as the Beaver Slide Slum, and I found the bungalow home on Fair Street where he spent his childhood. I located the building in which his uncle's cleaning and pressing shop was, and I walked the greens of the golf courses where he caddied as a youth. And I traced what was likely the path that he walked to the Atlanta University Laboratory School and then Morehouse College. And then I also visited the location of his first office in the YMCA building on Butler Street, where, during the Great Depression, Kendricks worked as a government employee doing public relations and publicity for New Deal programs. During World War II, the United States Army drafted Kendricks, literally, to do the same kind of work. And by the war's end, Kendricks was eager to move away from nonprofit public relations on behalf of the state to commercial marketing, which he believed, understandably, might be personally more profitable. And so, acting on that assumption, in 1948, he founded his own public relations firm in Washington, D.C., the Moss H. Kendricks Organization. And through this firm, or his firm, he marketed himself as an expert on the Negro market to corporations that he hoped might be tempted to pursue Black markets that Johnson's enterprise had revealed. And in 1951, using a sales pitch that essentially boiled down to, "I will increase your share of the African American market," Kendricks landed the Coca-Cola Company as a client, which established him as one of the most prominent Black marketing men on the Eastern Seaboard. Out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of him? Yeah, right? Crazy. Here's a picture of Kendricks in his office at MHKO, and I'll just have you notice the Coca-Cola bottle in front of him. During the time that he represented Coca-Cola, from 1951 to roughly the mid-60s, he rarely appeared in public, if possible, without a Coke in his hand or nearby, particularly in photographs, right? That's the degree of a marketing fanatic that he was, right? So Coca-Cola contracted Kendricks to formulate and oversee its turn towards African Americans, which after the war were being touted as a huge undertapped market, the size of Canada. To that point, the beverage giant had soundly ignored African Americans, and as a result, it was losing that business to its competitors, most notably Pepsi and Yoo-Hoo. To be clear, Coca-Cola was hardly alone in its neglect of Black consumers. For the first half of the 20th century, advertisers did not target African Americans as consumers because, among other things, they didn't think Blacks had money, they thought Blacks were too unsophisticated to respond to targeted appeals, and they did not want their products to be considered Black products, and thus possibly repel the general market, which at the time, as is true now, meant white consumers. But of course, Blacks were consumers. In fact, because domestic service remained the #1 occupation for black women into World War II, many of them were the primary purchaser in their own home as well as the homes of their white employers. And as we know, African Americans have often leveraged their consumer role seeking their rights, such as in the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaigns of the 1930s. Nevertheless, advertisements in popular post-war magazines, post-World War II magazines, depicted African Americans as a maid, waiter, personal servant, field hand, or slave over 75% of the time. Meaning that over 75% of the time, African Americans appeared not as consumers, or more pointedly, as non-consumers, the primary role of which was to visually and figuratively set off whites and their consumerism. And as you can see, Coca-Cola had been no exception. So coming out of World War II, the overriding denial of their consumer role presented African Americans with a real problem. It was a time when every major institution in the country, including the government, big business, media, and even the church, was instructing Americans to buy, buy, buy. Because after the war, the nation entered into a period of reconversion and also economic reorganization and recovery. And in addition, relations between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union were growing chillier by the moment. Therefore, Americans' consumerism was perceived as essential to the nation's economic health, security, global position, and exceptionalism. And these circumstances help explain why, during the early Cold War years, the American dream was reorganized around an ethos of mass consumption. And as historian Elizabeth Cohn has detailed so well, mass consumerism became a civic duty, central to dominant definitions and expectations of American citizenship and Americanness. And in this context, African Americans suffered greatly for lack of a popularly recognized and accepted cultural consumer identity, an identity historically best facilitated through advertising. And this is when Kendricks then enters the civil rights narrative, in my opinion. Because despite being one black man in a predominantly white profession, Kendricks' relationship to Coca-Cola gave him unique power to disrupt the mainstream representation of African Americans. Why was that? Well, for one, Coca-Cola executives hired and essentialized Kendricks as an expert on black people, and he absolutely encouraged this. And they invested him with the corresponding authority to determine how to approach black markets. Second, after World War II, Coca-Cola was the most recognizable and most loved brand in the world, with an advertising budget that reflected and assured its status as such. Meaning that Kendricks exercised significant control over a hugely influential vehicle for producing and circulating mainstream visuals. And with that power, he directed Coca-Cola to recognize, but more importantly, to represent African Americans as quintessential consumers at precisely the time it mattered most. And this is where his agenda converged then with Johnson's. Because coaxing Coca-Cola executives into the new territory of marketing to African Americans required that, one, they be convinced of significant black consumer markets, and two, providing them with a vehicle through which they could target those markets, preferably without white Americans noticing. And Johnson's publications accomplished both. By leveraging Ebony's utility as a marketing tool to target blacks, Kendricks convinced the Coca-Cola Company to produce its first marketing materials that not only marketed to black consumers, but also marketed blacks as consumers. Appearing in 1955, Coke's family favorite campaign presented an image of blackness in which African Americans appeared as typical Americans, central to their own American stories, by virtue of their belonging to happy and healthy nuclear families and modern middle-class households, and their enthusiastic embrace of a consumerist lifestyle. In other words, these ads visually redefined African Americans as integral members of the American consumer class, which, again, in the early Cold War period, asserted and amplified their belonging, value, and contributions as consumer citizens, and thereby advanced their citizenship claims. Now, in my book, I argue that the image politics behind these ads differed from the traditional respectability or politics of respectability impulse to present African Americans as extraordinary or exceptional. Circulating through the marketplace and pop culture, the family favorite ads established blacks as completely ordinary. Right? Rather than exceptional, they appeared as average Americans, with average meaning normal. And as representations of normalcy, these marketplace media images made African Americans culturally visible as ideal Americans, but also conveniently invisible as controversial or disturbing or different. So, picturing blacks consuming rather than serving Coca-Cola, the marketing materials that Kendricks generated forged visual and conceptual associations between blackness and Americanness, with African Americans literally imbibing their American identity from green glass bottles. So as a black marketer, Kendricks had successfully recruited one of the largest and most powerful corporations in the world at the time to the project of elevating African Americans as good, normal Americans by recognizing and representing them as good consumers. It was hardly activism, given that the ultimate goal was profits for Coca-Cola and, of course, his own firm. But his image work, in combination with Johnson's, represents important civil rights work in that it absolutely furthered other contemporary civil rights efforts promoting first-class citizenship for African Americans. And so for that reason, I would argue that this is no less a civil rights image than this, or this, or this, or this. And if I left it here, we'd have an uplifting history of progress. But as tools of racial progress, the early Coca-Cola black ads were not without their problems. For one, to formulate African Americans' equalities as consumers, these ads mimicked Coca-Cola's general market ads. Exactly. So as a result, I contend that these ads upheld racial boundaries in U.S. society and visual culture by adhering to an identical but separate presentation of black societal position at precisely the moment that civil rights activists and organizations were assailing the separate but equal doctrine fundamental to racial segregation and discrimination, most notably in the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case. Also, as they were very much intended to, these marketplace images privileged middle-class blackness at a time when social, economic, political, and explicitly racist barriers kept most African Americans from a middle-class experience, at least as idealized in the American dream. Similarly, these ads valorized heteronormativity, though no one would have used that term at the time, right? So in other words, even as they signaled blacks' inclusion by way of their consumer role, these ads constructed and reinforced categories of exclusion that impeded and continue to impede African Americans' freedom and equality, as well as that of other marginalized groups. So no, this is not a triumphalist civil rights narrative, but I would argue that we have more than enough of those. What we need are useful histories relevant to where we are and where we want to go. And useful histories are inherently complex. The history of how, as black media and marketing men, John Johnson and Moss Kendricks made the market work for racial progress on their way to making money is complicated. It shows us that in addition to protest, African Americans have pursued their rights through institutions that rely on and reproduce inequity and inequality. which I think merely illuminates the complex nature of their oppression. And my question becomes, could African Americans in the post-war period have avoided doing so? Which then brings us all the way back to this question. Does the experience of freedom and equality in the United States require going through or shoring up institutions of oppression? And then, given the exclusionary elements that I just pointed to in the Black media images generated by post-war Black capitalists, we must also consider this question. Is it possible to achieve freedom through the market? Now, as a historian, both of these questions are equally vexing to me, and they have been for a long, long time. But as a woman of color and the mother of a 3.5-year-old, you want to know what keeps me up at night? It's the combination of the two. Because what if freedom and social equality in a capitalist society does require going through the market, but it's impossible to achieve either through the market? Where does that leave us? Where does that leave her? Thank you.